Thank you for joining the carrier training session for Schlumberger's transportation management system here in North America, invoice submission. What we want to discuss in this training video is the invoice submission process flow for submitting an invoice within the TMS. We're going to demonstrate, just as you've seen in previous videos, how these actions are actually taken into the TMS, and we'll further discuss some additional next steps on an additional training video with some invoice exceptions. By this point in the training video series, you have seen a TMS overview, you've seen the tender acceptance or the tender management training video, you have also now seen the gating events training video, and from a standard workflow perspective, this training video will focus on the invoice submission. On a later training video, we will show you some of the options related to the invoice management within the TMS. Some of these options are related to recalling an invoice in the event you have noticed that you have missed a charge or an incorrect charge. You have the ability to recall the invoice to make updates. We will also show you the credit note process and also the balance due or the debit notes process. For purposes of this scenario and this training video, we will focus on the invoice submission within the process flow. In previous training videos, you noticed under tender management, we had accepted a carrier tender within the TMS. We also executed the shipment by providing gating events within the TMS. We will continue to build on that original shipment and now look at the application or the TMS and how it is that we can provide that invoice submission process. Under the TMS, you will note that we will now move forward to the submenu called Finance. We will focus on the standard invoice, which is where the invoice has already been electronically created by the TMS. We had mentioned before the importance of the gating events. As the gating events have been submitted, the electronic invoice will be created within 24 hours of that submission of the gating events. Let's focus on that standard invoice. If we simply select on the standard invoice, this is the working queue of all the invoices that the TMS has automatically created for you. If we want to focus our attention to a specific shipment or a specific invoice, we simply refine the query. We can actually look for our carrier reference that we submitted at tender acceptance. And we will note that this specific invoice is associated to the carrier reference that we had accepted and executed by providing the gating events. In order to proceed to make changes to the invoices, the first step is to recognize the ID. As we look or drill down into the invoice itself, you will notice in the top left corner we have a required field for invoice number. Please pay specific attention to this field. Although it is a free text field, here is the opportunity to further link your invoice generated by your systems with the Schlumberger shipment ID associated here. You also have a reference that you previously submitted under tender management. The objective of this field being free text is so that you can place whichever number you deem appropriate to be able to track between the TMS system and your internal systems. For purposes of this scenario, I will simply place the following designation simply as an example. You will also note the total cost of this invoice that was electronically created by the TMS. You'll notice a base cost or a line haul cost of this specific charge. For all practical purposes, depending on the logistics scenario, the TMS will be calculating the base cost and the fuel surcharge on your behalf. Furthermore, On behalf of Schlumberger, we will also be calculating systemically the base cost and the fuel surcharge based on commitments that we have in our contract. In the event we need to add a new line item, for example, beyond the line haul or the fuel surcharge, we can add an additional line item to this invoice so that the TMS can be updated with the proper cost. Let's look at the process of adding a new line item. Once you have submitted your invoice number, we can go down to the new line item, and you'll notice that line item sequence number is being asked. Let's pay specific attention to the line item sequence. On this particular invoice, the first item is actually a base cost at a certain value. When we add our new line item, we will continue to add the line item sequence within the application. For all practical purposes, let's take the example that we are adding a hotel expense. We noticed that on the invoice, the line item sequence for the base cost, or the costs that were calculated by the TMS, were a total value of 1. The second value, or the item value of the line item sequence here, will automatically be 2. The freight charge, or the free text field, is where you can place the total value of that cost. For all practical purposes, I will simply place this value. The cost type will automatically default for accessorial. There is absolutely no need to change this cost type. You can refrain from changing this and continue with the process. Under charge description, although a required field, it is a free text field. You can add a description that you may feel necessary. And the only other field to submit at this time is called the accessorial code. Within the TMS, you will notice that you have an F for find and an L for list. These lists, although available on the list of accessorial, these fields are automatically called auto-populate. What this actually means is if we know that there is a wholesale charge associated with this particular invoice, we can begin to type the type of cost associated that we want to add. In this particular cost, we want to associate a hotel charge as an accessorial code. We simply select the hotel charge. Once we have identified the line item sequence, the actual cost for that freight line, the cost type, which is automatically default to accessorial, a charge description, and an accessorial code, we have successfully added the line simply by hitting save. When we hit save, it will bring us back to the header of the invoice, and you will notice the base cost, and furthermore, you will also notice the accessorial cost that has been added. Once you continue to finish adding the necessary or needed contractual line items to your invoice, you are now in a position to finish this invoice. Please note that the word finish in this example simply hits save. By hitting finish, this does not mean you have successfully submitted the invoice to Schlumberger. By hitting finished, it simply means you have saved your transaction. You have saved the work that you have completed within this invoice. Let's take that action. You have successfully modified the following records. This is another simple way of saying you have saved the work that you have added to that invoice. By checking Check in Actions, you will notice that there's an action called Submit Invoice to Schlumberger. Once you have submitted your invoice to Schlumberger, taking this action, this will trigger the approval process on the Schlumberger side. Prior to submitting your invoice, you may want to consider further loading a document as proof of the actual charge. Let's take a quick peek at that process. By simply checking the check and the actions, you will notice that you have a menu here, or an action button that says Upload Document. This upload document features works like anything else that you may be familiar to, whether it's Microsoft Outlook, which is more commonly to everyone, and you simply have a browse function. I'm simply going to select a document from my desktop, a blank document, simply to demonstrate that we are able to upload a document into the TMS as proof. The documents that you are loading will also become visible to Schlumberger. Once you have selected the document, you simply hit upload, and you will receive a successful message associated to this document. There is nothing further to do related to documents. Once you have finished your invoice, adding your cost, you have selected or where appropriate uploaded the document, you can now take the action of submit invoice to Schlumberger. Once you've taken this action, you will note that you will receive this confirmation that the submit invoice has been initiated. As you continue to exit through these screens and come back to the actual header line, you will notice that if you refresh your screen, the invoice has now been submitted to Schlumberger and is no longer available under standard invoice queue. At this point, we have seen the invoice submission demonstration, and there are certain points to call out at this time. During the invoice submission process, this is heavily initiated by the carrier. During the invoice submission process, this is initiated by the carrier. The electronic invoice is automatically created 24 hours after event entry. You also have the opportunity to upload documents before you submit this invoice to Schlumberger. We want to recall and highlight certain actions. For example, you have the opportunity to provide a carrier invoice number. After you've made the necessary changes to your invoice, Finish does not submit your invoice to Schlumberger. It simply saves your work that you have created. At that point, you can upload documents and then take the systemic action to submit that invoice to Schlumberger. Once the invoices have been submitted to Schlumberger, they will also be approved by Schlumberger, and where there are corrections or costs that are in dispute, those communications can be managed at that time. Regarding payments, payments will be made upon the agreed payment terms within your contract. In a future training video, we will discuss invoicing exceptions. We will consider how to recall an invoice after you have submitted to Schlumberger in the event you want to make a change. We will further discuss the credit note process and finally the balance due. Thank you for joining and hope that this information has been helpful regarding invoice submission within the TMS.